Recently, I discovered the channel RedSignalArchives, which is full of multiple analog horror videos, and truthfully, I find this channel very enjoyable because of how odd yet engaging their stories are. Links are in the description. They have analog horror videos about families, pets, dinosaurs, the moon, TV shows, schools, etc. If there's something specific you're looking for, there's a chance you might find it there, and if you need a bit more convincing to actually check out the channel yourself, today I'll be sharing one of their series. And the one that I decided to talk about today is their camp series because it's crazy confusing but also pretty fun because it involves death loops and broken consciousness. I wonder if this series will continue to convince me to stay an indoor person. Anyways, enough of this intro. If you're ready to jump into the series with me, set up your tents, roast a marshmallow, like the video too while you're at it, and as always, my name is Estrella. Let's explore. If you don't remember arriving, get out now. In the beginning of episode 1, we get introduced to a guy named Tyler who starts to explain his odd situation to us. He woke up in the morning and unexpectedly found himself in a fully set up campsite, but he has no recollection of arriving or unpacking. His two other friends, Zoe and Ben, are also experiencing the same lack of memories, which is unnerving. The furthest they can remember is driving on the road, but apart from that, everything is blank. And what makes things even stranger is how everything is set up exactly how the group would have done it themselves, but again, they have zero memories of unpacking. Zoe tries to excuse this by saying maybe they were just tired and forgot. However, she wasn't even fully convinced by her own assumption, and Ben said that would be too unbelievable if that was the case. Tyler then goes detective mode and further analyzes the camp, taking note that the firewood and kindling for the fire had completely turned into charcoal, indicating that it's been burning all night, meaning someone had to have been awake to keep it going. In addition to that, he noticed the fully set up coffee table, which he soon asked Zoe if she was the one responsible for preparing it, and she admits that it was just there when she woke up and it had coffee already ready for her to drink. This sparked more confusion in the group, but then another more concerning fact appeared. There's certain items in the campsite that they do own and use for camping, but they don't remember packing those items into the car. An example of one of these items is Ben's radio, which they soon turn on in hopes to play music to calm their nerves, but instead, shockingly, they hear their own voices playing back to them. It wasn't anything sinister, just a simple conversation about marshmallows and s'mores, which surprisingly gave Tyler the feeling of deja vu, but he wasn't sure when this conversation happened. Regardless, the radio soon malfunctioned, and that wasn't the only thing that suddenly stopped working. Ben's watch was discovered to be broken, showing the wrong date compared to what was shown on their phones, which confused the group, but then they got distracted by the radio suddenly working again, and the voice coming out unexpectedly belonged to Tyler, and it sounded like he was in the bottom of a well. In the message, he explains to whoever is listening that it's too late for them and they're already trapped in a loop where there's no going back. In response to this unsettling message, Ben tried to unplug the power to the radio, however, the voice continued, saying they were brought here and are now a part of it, like everyone else who'd never left. That's where the message concluded, and the group is obviously shaken up and Ben wants to leave. So they started to pack their items, but this is when Tyler discovered 3 sets of footprints circling around their camp, indicating people were around while the group were sleeping. However, they soon recognized the prints matching the bottoms of all of their shoes. It was their footprints. This discovery then made Zoe take a moment to think before asking the question, what if they didn't just forget arriving? What if they never actually arrived? This odd question obviously confused Tyler, but before he could respond, the radio turned on again and it was an unrecognizable voice with a slight accent, and there were also the sounds of typing in the background. The voice goes on to welcome the group to the remnants loop and reassures them that the lack of memories is perfectly normal. The reason for this is because after every 72 hours, the loop resets, which interferes with their memories, and the reason why everything is set up to their liking is because the group has been there before, many times in fact. Now, the reason why it's 72 hours is because the group is given 2 days to figure out how to break the loop. That's the good news. The bad news, however, is that everyone else before them has failed, and these odd messages in the radio are echoes from the past because that's the only way they can help those in the future. But back to the unfamiliar voice. It's a doctor named Marcus, and they've been studying the phenomenon in the woods for a while. Sadly, before they could continue to elaborate, that's when the radio decided to stop working again. Left with no other choice, the group started to think of a game plan, and the first idea was to never split up. Ben then suggests that they should just get into the car and run. However, Tyler assumes that they were already done that in a previous loop because that's the obvious choice and it probably won't work. Tyler then noticed on a branch a piece of fabric that resembled the same flannel he had on. However, it appeared withered and old. The next discovery after that was Tyler's journal with entries in his handwriting, but he obviously had no recollection of writing those entries, so it was clearly from past loops. Now, the most noteworthy entry was the last one, which was day 17, which confused me because I thought they only had 2 days. Regardless, it goes on to explain how Dr. Vale found them, whoever that is, Zoe is gone, and Ben is changing. The writing also goes on to say to not trust the helpful camper, and that the loop is breaking down. However, it's not setting them free, but instead changing the group, changing them into something that belongs there permanently. Suddenly, the radio turned on again. This time it was Ben's voice. In Ben's message, it was directed towards Tyler, telling him that if he's listening to this, that means they're already dead. Regardless, he's still going to explain in the message that the loop doesn't just resets time, but it resets them. They're going to die there repeatedly until there's nothing left of what they used to be. Then after that, a laughter could be heard in the background, which could be Ben's, but something seemed off about it. It didn't exactly seem human. With that, the message ends and something could be heard coming from the trees as the sun falls from the sky. That's the conclusion to the first video, and to share my thoughts, I'm always a sucker for time loop stories. Nothing is more unsettling than knowing that you're trapped in a loop, in which you're unsure which actions you've already done and which ones will actually help you in the long run. It specifically taps into the fear of feeling powerless and making the wrong choices, but in this story there's also the fear of the unknown, because who knows what's going on in those woods. All the messages that they heard are so vague that it's hard to determine what happened to their past iterations. Is something in the woods taking their lives? Do their bodies corrupt and turn into monsters, or do they just go insane? Well, clearly the group are in an elaborate experiment based on that message from the doctor with the purpose to understand the phenomenon in those woods, so we know that at least. But here's something I find interesting. Time and their bodies might be resetting, but apparently their surroundings aren't. Not fully, at least. If that was the case, then that fabric and the journal shouldn't be there and have those entries. So maybe it's strictly living things that are affected by the phenomenon, or it's circumstantial. Honestly, I would love to see a movie with this plot, not gonna lie. But anyways, so let's now move on to the next camp video. If the campfire burns blue, keep quiet. The second episode isn't a continuation to Tyler's perspective, but instead we get introduced to 2 different characters named Avery and Cam. While trying to relax, the 2 couldn't help but notice that something was clearly wrong about their fire. Not only was it blue, but it had a hint of coldness mixed with its warmth, and whispers could be heard coming from the flames. So, leaning in closer to better hear the whispers, Cam was shocked to discover it was a conversation that they had just moments ago. However, there was something off about their voices. This is obviously ruining their little getaway from the stresses in life, so Cam attempted to snuff the flames until Avery stopped him because she noticed 3 people off in the distance. It was 2 guys and 1 girl who were chilling around their own campfire. In response to this, Cam tried to give them a friendly greeting, but they just blankly stared at him, and their presence was a little creepy and uncanny, to say the least. So returning back to his own campfire, suddenly the 2 started to hear more conversations from the flames, but it wasn't them talking this time. Instead, they heard a guy calling out to Tyler, meaning those voices are from the group in episode 1. Ben tells Tyler that they should just pack up and leave, but Tyler rejects the suggestion because it took them 6 hours to get there, and a spooky camp story shouldn't stop their fun. Zoe then speaks up, backing up Ben because something doesn't feel right, that something is watching them. In response to this, Avery has gone completely pale and she proceeds to back away from the fire while saying those people are talking about them, that they're the ones giving them the feeling of being watched. And this is the moment when Cam was able to better make out their appearances and notice how completely still they were standing. But back to the blue fire, the voices from it grew louder, which some sounded recent while others seemed like they were from many years ago. And one noteworthy conversation was from a man and a woman named Richard and Elena, who Avery seemed to have recognized. But more on that later, because first she wants to pack up and leave. So she starts to collect their items, and from the flames, they could hear Zoe talking to Tyler, telling him that the 2 are leaving. But Tyler responds by saying they weren't leaving, but they are them from tomorrow night? This confusing comment caught Cam off guard, then he discovered a journal nearby, which surprised him because he doesn't normally keep journals. Regardless, he opened it, flipped to the first day page, and discovered his handwriting inside, which talked about the blue fire and the conversations that were overheard from it. The flames shared the voices from those who have never left, and the writing goes on to say that they should have listened and ran away when they had the chance. But now they're stuck in the loop and are adding more voices to the fire. Additionally, tomorrow night, they'll be the ones watching the new campers arrive, and try to warn them, but they won't listen. They never do. The flames will eventually take away their memories and then everything else. In response to this, Cam of course tries to show this to Avery, but it seems like she already knew what was written down. Specifically, she has seen it before. Not here, but somewhere else a long time ago with her parents. Then suddenly, this is when the three uncanny people from before proceeded to walk towards the two, but they aren't going to stick around to chat, so they started to run. However, the voices from the flames were still audible, and Cam could hear his voice pleading before it changed to Avery's voice, talking about a pattern that repeats every night. New campers will arrive, hear the voices coming from the blue fire, and eventually join them. After her voice was then an unfamiliar man's voice talking about an experiment that can't be stopped, and it involves consciousness transfer fragments that are looping forever. Crazy stuff, but back to the two, they managed to run far away enough to the point where they can't see the blue lights anymore or hear the voices. So taking a moment to catch their breaths, Cam questions what the heck was that, and Ivory quietly responds, believing that what they heard was them, but from a different time. Tomorrow night, or maybe the past? Time is complicated there. Anyways, Cam soon notices that Avery was crying, and it's because the two people that they heard earlier named Elena and Richard sounded like her parents. From what Cam can remember, he knows that her parents died when she was younger, but he doesn't know too many details. Regardless, they need to focus on getting out of there, but sadly, they seem to have been a little lost until eventually they spotted a campfire in the distance, which initially brought them joy until they moved closer and realized that the two people there were them from earlier, and they are having the same conversation about the unusual fire and the voices coming from it. In response, Cam wanted to leave, but Avery whispered, saying that this is where the loop begins, and that's when their doubles looked towards them, and just like when Cam gave a friendly greeting to the three campers earlier, his double greeted them similarly. Cam and Ivory then found themselves unable to move, and everything that played out before went the exact same here. They are now stuck in a loop. They're trying to warn the others, but they will never listen. New voices will join the fire. And that's the conclusion to episode 2, and that was pretty trippy, am I right? Honestly, I got very confused watching this, I'm not going to lie. I know, like, at least the one thing that's still the same is that the premise of an odd experiment and phenomenon being studied in the area, which these two found themselves trapped in, like the first group. But arguably, I would say that these two have a much more complicated situation. With that in mind, let's now move on to the next episode to gather more information. If you hear your voice in the woods, run. In the beginning of episode 3, we returned back to Tyler and his friends who found themselves around a campfire that they don't remember making but probably did, and the sounds of humming could be heard from the woods, which was a little hypnotic. But eventually, that echoing melody stopped, leaving the woods completely silent, and the group reiterated their agreement to stick together no matter what, until Tyler's voice could be heard in the woods, and it was yelling and begging for help, which made him want to go into the woods to potentially rescue himself. That obviously sounded pretty idiotic because Tyler is there and he's himself, so whatever that thing is, it's not him, right? Well, with all the time interference and loops and weird echoes, it technically could be him, but a different version of him from a different time. So reluctantly, Ben joined Zoe and Tyler to avoid splitting up so they could search for the other Tyler, who's now screaming about the lights. This comment about the lights is important because it turns out the group saw those lights before, which are becoming more prominent as they walk deeper into the woods. The lights warp into patterns before eventually showing reflections of the past, consciousness, or memories. Examples are visuals of humming machinery and the view of an obsessive and grieving man in a lab coat near a pulsing light. The word consciousness transfer then escapes Tyler's mouth, and he proceeds to talk about an experiment that involves transferring someone's consciousness, specifically transferring someone to a different body, but something went wrong, and instead it caused fragments to split apart, which involves those lights. And he doesn't know how he knows this, but we can obviously assume that these fragments might be responsible for this sudden recollection and visions. But ignoring that, Tyler then encounters the Tyler who's been screaming out for help, and it appears to be his reflection, which is technically as real as him, but something just isn't right. His reflection appeared sinister, and it tells Tyler that he's the better version because he accepted the lights to come inside him. If Tyler wants to be better and eternal, he should do the same. This is when the lights started to aggressively press themselves against him to make him a part of their patterns, and Tyler almost gave in, but luckily Zoe and Ben broke him out of his trance, telling him that he's stronger than those lights, and that they are trying to tempt him into becoming something that he isn't. Tyler is a good guy who cares about them. He didn't run into the woods because he was curious, it's because he genuinely wanted to see if someone needed help, so he can't give in to those lights. This caused Tyler's reflection to panic and get a bit irritated as it started to fade out of existence, and it tries to argue, but there's no more convincing it can do because Tyler agrees with his friends. So before disappearing, his reflection tells Tyler that eventually he'll give in and join the patterns. In response, Tyler says maybe, but for tonight, that's not happening. The lights then completely scattered and the woods slowly got more warmer and kind of normal-ish. The group then returns back to their campfire and Tyler has a better understanding of what's going on thanks to the fragments and memories. Something is controlling those lights and the location they are in is a testing ground for transferring consciousness, and as a consequence to those experiments, fragments of consciousness are being trapped in a loop in those woods. To stop this, they need to stop the people running these experiments. So filled with determination, they decided that they'll try to find a way to end this for good, and it involves finding that location with the humming machinery that Tyler briefly saw. And that's episode 3. Wasn't that fun? Honestly, when it comes to loops, people tend to forget that the iterations can be wildly different to the next. In one of them, Tyler can be heroic, and in the next, he could succumb to the corruption from the woods. Regardless, it's cool that the group have a bigger goal in mind aside from just escaping. They want to end these experiments in hopes to not only free themselves, but to free the fragments from the loop. How noble. With that, let's now move on to episode 4. If they never leave the cabin, they're not human. In this video, we return back to Avery and Cam, in which Avery starts to explain how strange her trip is going. While hiking, they notice smoke coming from the trees, but it doesn't seem like it was coming from a campfire. So feeling a bit curious, Cam mostly, the two went towards the smoke and it was coming from a ranger camp. And inside were noticeably 3 people, 2 guys and a girl, that's familiar, and they all had their gear scattered around. At first glance, Avery assumed they were ordinary campers, but after watching their movements closely, it appeared more like a performance, like they were pretending to be campers. Regardless, Cam still knocked on the door to make sure the group were okay and to see if the smoke was an issue. To which the girl inside answered and introduced herself as Zoe before reassuring them that everything is fine and they're just setting up a fire. The two were then welcomed inside and got introduced to Tyler and Ben, and they all had a moment to chat before the group of 3 proceeded to show Avery and Cam something strange that they found in the cabin. In a separate room was a hospital or lab equipment that didn't appear abandoned since it looked fresh and clean, and in that room was also a clipboard with writing that says Meridian Cognitive Labs. Project Eternal. Remember that, everyone. Now, this name instantly triggered recognition from Avery because that's where her father once worked at before his death, and in response, she wants to leave with Cam, but as they turned towards the door, it was suddenly gone. This confused the group, and Tyler soon pulled out his phone because he got a message warning him to not go into the cabin, and surprisingly, this message was sent from himself. The others then checked their own phones, realizing that they had missed calls and messages from odd times, and this was actually the moment when they finally realized that there's something in general strange happening with time, and when they looked outside the windows, it was completely dark, almost like they were staring into a void. But that's not the only issue. Zoe's voice soon could be heard from the other side of the wall, but Zoe is trapped in the same room with the group. So who's that? Well, luckily the door soon returned, and after opening it, they were unexpectedly greeted by Zoe. But there was something wrong about this Zoe. Her eyes, teeth, and the way she acted was just not right. In response to this sight, Zoe said that the thing wasn't her, but the fake Zoe said it was, and then more fake versions soon stepped forward, looking just as wrong as the fake Zoe. Tyler then got into a confrontation with his fake version, while Cam and Avery jumped out the window, not wanting to get involved. That was smart. The two then kept running until they eventually returned to their own campfire, and after catching their breaths, Avery checked the time on her phone and was surprised to discover that they've been gone for 6 hours despite feeling like they were only gone for a few minutes. And similarly to Tyler, Avery realized that she got a message from herself, specifically 3 hours ago, and it was warning her to not go into that cabin. Cam then noticed a familiar smoke appearing in the sky again, but that's not important right now because what really matters is the report Avery managed to grab from the lab room before running. On the paper, it has a patient's name, which was one that was extremely familiar to Avery, Elena Hayes. She was a part of the Eternal Project and her status was transferred. This discovery made Avery want to go back because there's work that's connected to her parents, but Cam argued against this because of what just happened, so Avery then starts to explain the project from the few memories she had about it and tells Cam that it was a project with the goal to transfer consciousness to different bodies, but she believes a mistake happened during the testing which caused consciousness to be copied rather than moved, meaning what they saw were copies of consciousness from people who died in the woods. Echoes specifically, so the Zoe, Tyler, and Ben, who seemed a little bit off, weren't actually the real them. Instead, it was echoes of the past of one of their deaths. I hope that makes sense. So basically, think of it like a recording, and what's constantly being looped in that cabin is their deaths that happened in one of the loops. But anyways, that room that they discovered with the group indicates that there's still experiments being performed, and as a result, Avery now wants to help the group that they just met. Speaking of which, she gets a text message from herself telling her that the cabin wasn't real, but the people are, meaning what they saw are obviously echoes of someone's deaths, but these people are actually, they do exist, and they are trapped in a loop. So Avery, of course, wants to help them break free. And that was episode 4. Avery is clearly a lot more of an important character than I initially assumed, or technically her family, and with each episode, we're slowly getting more pieces to the puzzle of what's going on in these woods and how things work. But before I start sharing my theories, let's continue on to the next few episodes. If your friend asks for seconds, watch their eyes. Episode 5 opens with the perspective of Ben, and clearly something is wrong with him. For the past 3 days, he found himself unable to taste things, and his memories of certain actions and meals that he ate are, well, fuzzy. And at the moment, his friends don't seem to notice the change, and he hasn't brought it up either, but the situation was still obviously odd and scary for Ben. It also doesn't help that he started to feel like more of his actions weren't even his own, like something inside of him is taking control every once in a while. For example, when he packs his belongings back into his bag, for some reason he does it in the opposite way. Or when he hears the sounds of his laughter, it sounds more like a recording. And lastly, when he responds to his friend's questions, the correct response that he would make does come out, but it doesn't feel like he's responsible for saying those words. It's like he's a passenger in his own body. And here's another concerning fact. Ben can't help but feel like someone or something has been observing his every action to better understand why he does what he does. But before he could elaborate more on that, suddenly he found himself asking a question to his friends that he wouldn't normally ask. What happens to the parts of us that get left behind? Now, despite asking the question, he didn't need someone to answer because somehow he already knew deep down. Those parts just watch and learn until eventually they take over. And this is when Ben suddenly snapped out of it and he was himself again. He of course freaked out for a moment, but soon he starts to explain to his friends how it felt like he was a passenger in his own body and that something else used his body to interact with him. He also admits to feeling hungry and that there's certain parts to him that feel carved out. Specifically, it feels like something was consuming his memories, personality, etc. Tyler, of course, responded with concern and was even more determined to get out of there to save Ben, but this is the moment when Ben starts to feel like he was already losing himself again. Then unexpectedly, another Ben appeared from the tree lines, admitting that he got a bit lost, and this confused both Zoe and Tyler because there's now 2 Bens, and what's ironic is that they're both technically Ben. Specifically, the new one is a perfect copy of the original, who's the one we've been following throughout the video. However, there's one big difference. It can't properly feel emotions. It might be able to replicate everything else perfectly, but something like fear seems to be out of its reach. And when Tyler asked the 2 to answer a math question, Ben's copy was quick with their response, while the original Ben, for some reason, couldn't do the calculations in his mind. It was like he couldn't access that part of his brain where he memorizes how to do math. This soon made Ben realize that this isn't him being replaced or possessed. Instead, what's happening is more comparable to absorption. Something non-human is eating away at his mind, taking away the parts of him that make him who he is, all in hopes to become a hybrid mixed with his consciousness. Spooky. Anyways, Tyler soon connects the dots around the same time Ben did and starts to argue with the copy, saying that it isn't Ben because there's noticeable inconsistencies that make the double seem uncanny and obviously not human. Its perfect posture, smile, that's all wrong because humans aren't meant to be this hollow and perfect. In response to this, it seemed like the double considered Tyler to be a problem that needed to be eliminated, but it soon shifted back to its uncanny calmness and tried to dismiss Tyler's statement until Ben mustered enough strength to speak, telling his friends that the copy was draining him, and each day it's becoming stronger as a result. This shockingly caused the double's masked facade to slip, showing annoyance for a moment before telling Ben that he's freaking out their friends and that he needs to stop. The double then touches him, draining the last of his consciousness, but before getting completely consumed, he tells his friends to run. And once the double absorbed him fully, he didn't disappear, but instead he found himself a part of something larger, which he now is only a small piece of to the new Ben that's technically the more enhanced and perfect version of the original. And while looking through his eyes, he could see that his friends listened to his final plead, and they started to run far away from him. In response, Hybrid Ben tried to stop them by acting friendly, but Tyler and Zoe aren't stupid, so they kept going, while Original Ben tried his hardest to slow down the Hybrid from within. And luckily, they got away, but also they hope to one day save Ben in the future, but for now, the new Ben is just going to be a hunter in the woods that they have to avoid. And that was episode 6. Pretty tragic, honestly. I never thought I would be unsettled by the thought of consciousness fragments, but it's like they are a corrupted hive mind that no longer just wants to be fragments, but to be something whole. Specifically, they want to be something bigger and stronger, and the only way to do that is by consuming others. Wow. Anyways, I gotta save these theories for later, so let's now move on to the next episode. When the beacon turns red, leave someone behind. These video titles are getting crazier and crazier. Anyways, the video's in Zoe's perspective, and she explains to us that Ben has been gone for 3 days because he was pulled into a reflection in the lake, and suddenly a mysterious tower appeared, which Tyler is drawn to because he's convinced that that's the source of what's repeating their deaths. What an intro. But more on that later, because we then get told that Ben's voice, along with many others, could be heard in the woods every night, and they are constantly warning the two about the loops and the others who are trapped there. And when they're not hearing other people's voices, sometimes they hear their own conversations from the past. Regardless, the two soon went to the tower, and they took notes about the beacon turning red after every 12 hours, but what stuck out to me the most was the discoveries that they found near the woods. Ancient campsites, bunkers, and odd lab equipment, along with the sighting of Dr. Vale. And if you forgot, Vale was briefly mentioned in the first video when Tyler was reading his journal. Yeah, that one. And what was specifically written about him is that he found the group, which is coincidentally what is happening now with these two because they keep seeing glimpses of the man near their camp. What a weirdo. Anyways, the voices in the woods suddenly started to speak up again, and what they heard was a professional-sounding woman talking about a consciousness transfer trial. It's the 14th day, and the subject for the trial failed its integration, and she recommended terminating the Eternal Project because most subjects could be compromised. She then talks about a Dr. Marcus, who was the radio doctor from episode 1, and she claims that he objects to the shutdown of the project because he believes they're close to a breakthrough. And sadly, before we get to learn more, her voice cuts off with a burst of static, and it was replaced with Ben's voice, telling his friends that the loop isn't natural, but a recording system. When someone dies, their consciousness gets trapped in the signal, and their death will be broadcast repeatedly because that's what the equipment was designed to do. And when the tower's beacon is red, that indicates that the loop is active, and if they want to break the cycle, someone has to stay behind, or else it will start over with new victims. And the reason for this is because someone has to manually shut it down from within the tower, which is a sacrifice that will lead to that person becoming a part of the signal and echo. It's not an easy choice to make, but it has to be done, so without hesitation, Tyler volunteers to be left behind so Zoe could escape and tell the world about the experiments being done in the woods. Zoe tries to argue against this because she doesn't want to lose him, but Tyler was firm and he knows that she's been taking notes about everything, making her the obvious choice to leave because she would be better able to explain everything that was happening. That, and Tyler is pretty heroic and a selfless guy, so, of course, this choice shouldn't be that surprising that he wants to be left behind. Anyways, there's no time to argue because the voices from the woods started to become more prominent, indicating that the mimics were near. So Zoe started to run while Tyler went to the tower. Sadly, the shutdown system was a lot more complicated than he thought because the equipment has the fragments of the consciousness and they're fighting against the shutdown system. But lucky for Tyler, Ben's voice was helping him along the way. And before completely shutting everything off, Tyler used the system to speak to Zoe outside, and he told her that she has to figure out more about Project Eternal because it can't just be about consciousness transfer. It seems more like the people responsible wanted to create an army of voices that could influence people from far distances, so she needs to find answers. And in his final moments, he tells Zoe that they really did try to warn people, and that they didn't die for nothing. The systems then finally shut down, and the tower soon fell, and as it collapsed, Zoe instantly felt the change. The forest seemed more normal and less artificial, and when she approached the spot where the tower fell, it was instead just an empty clearing. All the evidence they found earlier, like the old campsites and equipment, just vanished. The only thing that remained was a convenient piece of paper, which Zoe took, and it was noticeably in Tyler's handwriting. He wrote that the loop was broken, but the source is still out there, so she has to find Meridian Cognitive Labs and make them pay. She obviously wants to avenge her friends' deaths, so she will go detective mode to learn what she can, and hopefully she can succeed and stop people from ending up in a similar situation that they were in. And the only reason why her and her friends were there in the first place is because of the amazing reviews they saw online, but it's clear to her now that those reviews were likely faked in order to lure people in, and obviously those woods can't be the only location where these experiments are being done, so an investigation has to be done. And until every experiment site with a loop is broken, Zoe can't rest. Wow. But honestly speaking, what can a college student do to stop a secret and dangerous organization? Zoe, you're great. You might be a little over your head here. But anyways, there's one more episode in the playlist, so let's get to that before moving on to the conclusion. Do not follow footsteps that stop mid-trail. We return to the perspective of Avery, and she's in disbelief that she was able to escape those woods and is low-key a little traumatized. And because she wasn't there when Tyler and Zoe stopped the loop, she still believes they're trapped in there, which made her feel a little guilty. By the way, she also admits that Cam is dead. Damn. Anyways, unlike Zoe, Avery managed to smuggle out evidence from the woods, but before she explains that, she first goes on to explain that she's the daughter of Richard, one of the scientists who we've already known, and he's the man responsible for Project Eternal. His intentions were good, but as we've witnessed, he kind of created a hell. As for the reason why Avery ended up in those woods, it's because her father scouted the area many years ago when she was younger, and recently, as an adult, she started to experience dreams of her sickly mother and her depressed father, seeing medical reports. So wanting to get away from it all and to clear her mind, she went to the location that she remembered her father scouting. And Cam only joined her because, he didn't want her to be alone, and this is how they unintentionally found themselves going to the location where Project Eternal was being done. Avery then admits that they should have realized the red flags before going into those woods because the reviews that they saw online were from the same few accounts, and the directions in those woods were far too specific. Regardless, they still went in, as we've already known, and as we also know as well, the first night they heard voices. But it was described a little bit more differently from the video we've seen with the blue fire. They heard voices coming from the lake, and when they walked over, they saw 3 people, a guy and 2 girls who jumped into the water and didn't emerge. So obviously a bit curious about what the heck they just saw and what happened. The 2 went to their campfire site place and found video recordings. In the first recording, they heard Tyler explaining pretty much the events of the first video, waking up in a perfectly set up camp with no memories of arriving. That was the first tape. And the more Cam and Avery investigated, the more recordings they find scattered about. In each recording, it was a different situation with different problems, an example being Ben getting dragged into the lake by a reflection. But here's the odd thing about these recordings. Some of them had dates from the future, one of which had Ivory's voice explaining her journey about finding these tapes. This was obviously alarming. This would be alarming to anyone in general, But back to Tyler's recordings. He is calling it the echo. Fragments of people who died in the parks are just echoes of the past or future, trapped in the woods in a loop that will constantly repeat to their deaths. I'll explain more about this in the conclusion because obviously these loops are pretty specific compared to just reliving a day. Anyways, the purpose for these recordings is so Tyler can warn people before they get themselves into any more trouble, and he also explains how every time him and his friends try to leave, they just end up circling back to the same clearing. Bam. After this discovery, Avery then starts to notice the group more and more frequently in this distance, doing what was said in those tapes, until one day she stumbled across Dr. Vale, the same suspicious guy from earlier. He was described as disheveled, carrying a medical bag, and his face was covered in surgical scars. And unlike with the other group, the doctor actually spoke to them and told Avery that she shouldn't be there. The reason for this is because Project Eternal is targeted for specific people, and the reviews made online about the woods is specifically tailor-made so those those people would be lured in. But anyways, we now finally learn the purpose for the project besides the little snippet of knowing that it involves consciousness transfer. It turns out they want to create immortality by separating the mind from the body, but as we've witnessed, many of those fragments found in the woods are something much more disturbed, making this project only have failed subjects. Vale then goes on to tell Avery that her father was weak, prioritizing love over progress. When his wife died, he wanted to shut down the project because they're not God and shouldn't be doing this. However, Vale and many of the other scientists refused, so they assassinated Richard so they could continue with his project, but without him, it's a lot more difficult to perfect it. The lab had so many failed experiments that they had to dump them all in a location, which were these woods. And the purpose for the loop is to act as a containment system, keeping those failed experiments inside, but consequently, everything that enters will be a part of it as well. However, there is a way to leave, and it requires some medical modification. Vale offers to do this to the two, but that's insane. So Cam soon attacked the crazy scientist so Avery could run, and while running, she could hear Cam screaming that she needs to get to the bottom of this before his voice completely goes silent. With that, she kept moving until she discovered familiar markings that she quickly realized her father left behind. When she was younger and he was scouting the area, it turns out he made a path that could bypass the loop. So she of course started to follow them until eventually she arrived at the main road where a ranger took her to the hospital because those few couple of days of walking weren't too kind. And when she was questioned, she couldn't exactly tell the truth, so she just gave vague responses or lies that seemed plausible. And to list off the evidence that she's obtained, you know what she mentioned in the beginning of this video, it's medical equipment from Vale's bag, those voice recordings that she's been listening throughout the whole video, and documents from her father's old jacket. In those documents, it had a lot of information about the project and his efforts to stop it. So Avery is going to use this to her advantage to build a case against the lab, Meridian lab. And after doing a bit more research and after getting everything put together well, she's going to show it to the public, her findings, and send packages to the authorities with her evidence so, you know, more investigations can be done. And she's aware that they will try to claim that she's crazy, but thanks to Tyler's recordings, which have Zoe's observations of the entities and Ben's breakdown of the reality, she just might be able to have a strong enough case. There's also a noticeable chain of murders involved with the lab that started with her father, so that's something. Investigations will, as I mentioned, likely be done to expose the truth of Meridian Labs, so it's inevitable that something will come to light once the information is out there. And Avery is very much aware that this is putting a target on her back, but she feels guilty for those three who are still trapped in the loop and for Cam's death. Project Eternal is no longer a project about creating eternal life. Instead, they created eternal suffering, and she can't just stand by, so she's holding a conference in hopes that the evidence will speak for itself. And before the video ends, Avery discovers one last tape that was in the back of her father's car, and it was a tape specifically for her. In the tape, he explains that the containment system is like a battery. All those fragments of consciousness feeds the system to keep the loop and experiments going. And the reason why the lab keeps harvesting all these consciousness is so they can continue the pursuit for immortality by farming these networks of consciousness. It might seem helpless, but then he tells Ivory that there is a kill switch to end it all. It's not in the woods, but in a location where him and her mother first talked about having children. She'll know it when she sees it, and this is the moment when it clicked in Avery's mind that he's talking about the old observatory in her campus where he proposed to her mother. So filled with newfound determination, she'll hold off on the conference that was scheduled that day just a little longer so she could go and stop the loop for good, so she could save Ben, Tyler, and Zoe. And that's where the video ends. Wasn't all of that confusing, but also kind of made sense? Well, if you still need someone to explain what the heck is going on, then let's now move on to the conclusion. Conclusion. This all begins with Richard wanting to save the life of his sick wife, so he tries to find a way to make her immortal, and that's what sparked the Eternal Project. And remember the vision that showed a grieving and obsessive guy in a lab coat? That had to be Richard. But anyways, he had good intentions, but he was surrounded by terrible people who soon eliminated him in order to continue running the experiments that he wanted to stop after his wife's death. Sadly, instead of achieving their goal of immortality, they ended up making a land of suffering in which the people trapped there are forced to live a cycle of death, in which their echoes are scattered about, showing their moments of, before the tragedy of their deaths. Ooh. Speaking of which, now I believe it's time to explain what the loop really is. Rather than it being the same day that's being repeated like in that one movie, Happy Death Day, it's a lot more complicated. Think of it like multiple alternate realities in one location in which time and life is only affected. Specifically, let's say there's one reality in which the group can go left or right. If they go right, then they end up dying. But if they go left, they'll be in an odd situation that will take them somewhere else, that will then take them to a different branching path that could lead them to their deaths or something else. This could explain why each time we revisit the groups, they're in different situations and experiencing different problems. The loop isn't the situations that they'll be facing, it's their lives, deaths technically. And honestly speaking, I wouldn't call it a loop. Rather, it's kind of more comparable to a video game in which when they die, they can reset in time, but sadly, they lose their memories once they come back to life. However, because the technical loop part of the situation, which is the echoes that they're seeing, those are their warning signs to avoid doing the same thing again that led to one of their deaths. And that's what those things are. Every time they see themselves, that means death is nearby. So yeah. Additionally, think of these woods as a bubble in which they are permanently stuck in a specific time frame, but once they leave, the world will start moving forward correctly again. And speaking of those woods, its entities specifically, they are fragments of human consciousness. Their goal is to either absorb or to make those people like them. Fragments that will try to infect the next loop, to make the loop bigger, to make it stronger, to make their consciousness one big weird pattern. The lights! Anyways, for example, that time when Ben was absorbed, or the time when Tyler had his reflection attempt to convince him to become one with those lights. The lights. Sorry. They're no longer human. There's something else that wants to become bigger and stronger, a network of consciousness that could possibly ruin the world if they were set free from those woods. Spooky. Now moving on to the ending, both Avery and Zoe made it out of their loop, yet Avery is under the impression that Zoe is still trapped there with her two friends. Why is that? Well, I have two guesses. My first assumption is that they found themselves in two different realities, alternate timelines, that thing. That's guess number one. Guess number two is that Avery did go to the observatory and flipped the kill switch, in which that's what caused the red beacon towers to appear in the woods, so the people that are trapped there could end it by, doing the shut-off system thingy in their respected locations, in their respected woods, because we're going by the assumption that there's multiple woods with multiple, loop weird situations. However, that assumption doesn't really make that much sense to me the more I think about it, because someone will have to die or become one with the signal to end the loop, and I feel like the kill switch is probably something better than just that. So an alternate reality thingy timeline is probably the more likely assumption, unless I'm interpreting something wrong. And if it is the case that it is a different, two different realities, then there's a chance that maybe in Zoe's reality, both Cam and Avery are alive, because Tyler's the one who ended the loop to free them. So yeah, unless they didn't die while the loop was being, turned off. Yeah. The ending is obviously very confusing, but stories that revolve around time manipulation and memory loss with different deaths and scenarios, of course it can be challenging to fully keep up with everything. Regardless, I still enjoy the story despite the few moments I got a bit of a headache, and the concept of echoes of past deaths is what mainly interested me about this whole story. And when it wasn't the echoes of deaths, it got really trippy when they just saw echoes of past events. Like the Blue Fire video, in which, Cam and Avery found themselves in a loop in which they keep seeing themselves running away from themselves, and the fire talking. It's crazy. It's crazy, but in a fun way, I guess. So yeah, what a crazy story, am I right? Well, there's even more crazier stories that could be found in the channel with even more weirder plots. So yeah, go check them out if you're interested. Links are in the description. But first, since you made it this far in the video, I hope that means you enjoyed. So please don't forget to subscribe, do that funny little notification thing, maybe follow my other social medias, leave a comment, and I better not catch you dying on me. Goodbye!